And I'm your host, Marix Seymour. Let's Talk Impact is about engaging urgent and sometimes uncomfortable topics relevant to ministry that positively changes the lives of people. And what's discussed on Let's Talk Impact could be the difference between your success and regret. Let's Talk Impact is intended to cause you to take an introspective look at how we approach leadership, organizational, and even personal development in this season. Let's Talk Impact promises to ignite the big aha moments for pastors and ministry leaders, organizations, and individuals responding to the call of God on their lives. And so, in this time, I want you to think about where you are and what are the things you're experiencing as a pastor and church leader. For a minute, ask yourself, do any of these terms resonate with me on how I feel at the end of each ministry week? Inadequacy, disappointment, anxiety, helplessness, confusion, isolation, fatigue, burnout, resentment. If any of those resonate with you, then we need to talk. So, an effective pastor is not only a spiritual leader, but also an effective administrator who brings order and organization rather, to the church's mission. One administrative skill that is essential to the effectiveness of pastoral leadership is their ability to lead community-based collaborations to meet the needs of the congregation and the community. And so in this episode, I have a special co-host with me, Dr. Jim Fields, and he's an organizer, an educator, a leader, an administrator, an innovator, a change agent. So welcome, Dr. Field. How are you?
I'm doing wonderful. Thank you for having me.
Awesome, awesome. And so, Dr. Field, during this time, we'll discuss the pastor leading community-based collaborations. And in our time together, our conversation is designed to make that whole idea of theory of leading collaborations applicable and practical to pastors and church leaders. And so there are some questions that I want to pick your mind with, and see what your thoughts are, especially because you are a pioneer in community-based collaborations. When I was reading your bio, it was extremely impressive, and I want to share with our listeners some of the things that you've accomplished. Just a small piece. You've been a part of the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless. You've been a part of the City of Chicago's Joint Community Police Training Program. You've been the executive director of Northwest Neighborhood Federation, and to name a few. And all of those had that common thread of bringing communities together for the good of the community. And so in this time, I would like for you to start out by just sort of telling us exactly who you are. Who are you as Jim Field?
So I am a retired community organizer who still does training and consulting. I was just in Memphis with a friend of yours, Bishop Marvin Frank Thomas, who's a longtime colleague and friend of mine. I live in the Chicago area. I have three grandchildren, two children. I have a big yellow dog named Bob. And my ministry was really community organizing. And I'll fill you in on how I got there, because originally I was studying to be a minister myself. So, and I love hiking with the dog. I love kayaking. I studied Tai Chi, been doing yoga my whole life. So I've got a nice full life and enjoying retirement. So
that whole idea of enjoying retirement, I'm sure that's going to resonate with a lot. So
yeah.
Again, you bring a wealth, even though you say retired. I noticed that you've retired a couple of times, right?
Yeah.
And so in the whole idea of what you bring to the table is crucial. Even though you are not doing it full time, the work that you do is still meaningful. And so if you would, then this is who you are, but you were alluded to what you started out. So tell us, where did you get your start, and what was the initial plan?
So I was born into a big Irish Catholic family. There
Hmm.
were eight siblings on my mother's side. They were farmers in Nebraska. On my father's side, there were six siblings, and they lived in Massachusetts, urban, and so a big family. And at 9 years old, if you were Catholic, you studied the lives of the saints. Everybody probably knows Saint Francis of Assisi
Hmm.
and his work,
Hmm.
but there was one in particular, Saint Damien, who is called Saint Damien the leper priest. And after he was ordained, he went to Oahu, lived with lepers, served the leper colony there, which was very isolated. Um, and then he caught leprosy and passed away. So for some reason, that really touched my heart. And I made decision then that I wanted to be a priest because I wanted to help people. I wanted to serve people. And that's who I saw people like him doing that. And so I joined the seminary at 14.
Okay. Wow.
I spent 11 wonderful years studying for the priesthood. And at a certain point, I went to graduate school, Catholic Theological Union in Hyde Park, Chicago. And by then, I had already gone to school for 18 years. I was sick of school. And I had the goal of getting the highest grades with the least amount of work.
Okay.
Not a very high ideal, but that's what I had to do to get where I wanted to go. But one of the priests agitated me, and I'll talk about that later, as a very powerful tool that I think ministers need to be exposed to. And it's an essential tool of community organizers. So I had asked this priest, a lot of them really enabled me to do this. And then I asked one priest, one of my teachers, get a can I get an extension on a paper I was supposed to have written?
Hmm.
And he did me the wonderful favor of not being nice to me. He said no. And then he looked me in the eye and he said, "Who do you think you're fooling and whose time do you think you're wasting?" So he did me a huge favor. I didn't feel like it at the time. So I went back to my room and really thought, I'm wasting my time doing this silly stuff. So I went out. I was invited to be a deacon at one of the local churches where I was doing an internship. I left school
Mm.
and went out there and had 4 wonderful years as the deacon. I did a lot of youth work and stuff. But more and more it became clear to me that this was not going to be my ministry, even though I had spent 11 years. So I left. So
Wow. 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 So while I'm sure your parents weren't exactly happy about that decision, uh, but your life has proven that it was the best decision.
yes.
Yeah, yeah. So let me ask you this: from the seminary to where you are now, what were some of the challenges during your journey? Because I don't want any pastor or church leader to feel like it was, oh, just a change of heart, and that to, change of heart today and tomorrow I'm a community organizer. What were some of the challenges along your journey?
So one key thing that changed my life, I was offered an internship while I was in the seminary after my junior year of college to go to Chicago. And I did. I worked in a hospital, and while there, I had my eyes open to race.
Mhm.
And I went, it was pretty jarring for me to kind of see something I hadn't seen before.
Mhm.
And I went from wanting to help people to wanting to change the world.
Okay. Okay.
And I thought this should be pretty easy. So I went back my junior year and I joined a civil rights group on campus. And this was 69 during the height of the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. And so from September to December, I was gung ho. I jumped in. I listened to a lot of people talk. I read a lot of books. I attended a march or two,
Okay.
but I was frustrated because I never saw anybody change. And that's why I did it. And so I lowered my expectations of changing the world
Mhm.
to changing like one individual or maybe a couple. By Easter, it was down to I just want to change one person. Uh, and so at the end of the year, I hadn't seen one person change. I was going through a lot of changes,
Mhm.
but I realized it was because I had experienced something.
Okay.
So, anyways, I said, this is not for me. I left, went back my senior year, had a wonderful time playing sports, acting, partying.
Okay.
And then I went to Catholic Theological Union in Hyde Park.
Mhm.
Um, and at the summer, when you start looking for your internships, I had signed up to go to Yellowstone and be a minister, have a kind of, picking up trash or something, but on Sunday. And I thought, this is good. It's going to be a free trip to Yellowstone and I'll get some practice. And then a friend of mine, I was having lunch with him one day and he was like really discombobulated. And I said to him, What's wrong? Because he was like nervous and spilling his coffee. And he said, I just interviewed with somebody. And I said, well, what did he do? Did he scream at you? Did he hit you? He said, no, no, he just asked me a lot of questions. I saw him later at dinner and he was even worse. His eyes were blinking and he didn't, 3 days later, he was twitching.
Mm.
So I asked him who it was and he gave me the name, never heard of the guy. It turned out it was Saul Alinsky. And Saul Alinsky is the one who adapted the principles of organizing from the union movement of the 30s to communities. And so I thought, I wasn't interested, but I thought, if that can happen to him, what's it going to do to me? Meaning, like a roller coaster. So I thought, I'm going to get on this ride and see if it shakes me up. So I went downtown Chicago and interviewed with a guy named Dick Harmon, who was one of Alinsky's assistants.
Mhm.
And he was talking about change in a very different way than I had heard when I was an activist. And
Oh,
there's
wow.
a big difference between the activism going on and organizing.
Okay.
Um, and I always compared the difference between a handyman electrician and a professional
Okay.
electrician.
Okay.
So, so I decided to switch because I was intrigued. He was talking about organizing is really democracy. It's teaching people how to effectively engage in democracy and begin to control their world, hold politicians accountable. So I did that internship and I saw people challenging Mayor Daley around a key issue that he wanted, and they were winning. And I saw a guy go through, a guy that many people would have thought was ultra conservative and all the other things attached to that. And I took him down to City Hall and he asked what were the city fathers doing about this particular issue, and they treated him like dirt.
Oh, wow.
Um, or more appropriate, if I can use the word, they treated him like shit.
Oh, wow. Wow.
And so I went back to his house with him because he was one of the first leaders I had, and I didn't want to lose him. But he was going through so many emotions. We're sitting in his kitchen, and on his refrigerator is a bumper sticker. You might remember it from the 60s two flags, America, love it or leave it.
Mm, mm,
And I thought, now I hadn't talked to this guy about race, theology, God, sports, nothing but the issue we were working on. And I kept asking him, "Are you okay?" But it was astounding to me that a year earlier, or 2 years earlier, that bumper sticker was aimed at me. And I knew where his head was. And at a certain point, and the emotions are just going across his face, he looks up and he says to me, maybe those kids protesting the war in Vietnam, maybe they're right.
mm,
So he just did a leap. And it wasn't because I talked to him or read him a book. It was because he experienced, again, sorry to use the word, but being shit on.
mhm,
And when I train people, I always try and teach them, farmers say poop all winter long, and they put it on their crops,
mm,
and it makes things grow. And it made him grow. And I realized the more I thought of it, that I changed because I experienced something, not because somebody talked to me.
mhm,
And that hits your head as opposed to your heart, and your heart changes things. So um, that had the most amazing transfer to me, because what I had tried for a year to accomplish, I couldn't do. And here in one summer, I saw this change.
mm,
But there were also principles of organizing that changed my life, because as a minister, I was used to the model of the leader, the one powerful leader, Moses.
mhm,
And I'm going to lead my people, and don't you worry, I'll take care of things. The organizing model is very different. It's leading from behind,
mm,
and it's really teaching you how to help other people grow, how to help other people change, how to help other people collectively take over life.
mm,
And one of the other principles of organizing, I can talk about it later, is don't do anything for anybody they can do for themselves. It is probably the most powerful thing. I think pastors need to understand that. I think teachers need to understand that, social workers,
mm,
because we're all being nice, helping people, but oftentimes we're getting in the way of their growth. And I can give you one quick story.
mhm,
My wife and I were, she was at home, I was working as an organizer, and I kept telling her, "You got to help my son Sean tie his shoes." And it kept getting put off. Pretty soon he was heading to school, and I was afraid the kids were going to make fun of him and stuff. So we had the same argument over and over again. And finally, she threw a dish towel on the floor and said, "Okay, I'll help him tie his shoes." So I was thrilled, because I didn't care whether he learned or not, but you got to learn how to tie a knot. And she was doing it for him. So I went to work that day. I was very happy. I got home that night and looked, he was wearing a new pair of shoes. You know what they were? They were Velcro. So we don't help people when we do everything for them. And so some of the other principles changed the way I would have looked at ministry. And then later I'll tell you how we use those principles to grow a church, and what I'm going to work with a bishop on.
Awesome, awesome. So a couple things that resonated when you were sharing about those moments. It just reminds me that uh, that mindset had to change. That the way you thought
Yes,
about things, the way
yes,
you approach the work,
yes,
there had to be a
yes,
mindset shift,
yes,
and the shift had to be somewhat of that I can do this, right? And so even for pastors, there has to be a mind shift, a mindset
yes,
change that I can not do everything for the
yes,
community, but
yes,
show community, help community do for itself. I like the
yes,
way you put that. It reminded me of a saying that a pastor, he's gone on to be with the Lord now, but his name was Dr. A.L. Patterson of Houston, and he said he would always say, "Learn how to lead the pack from the back." And
Yes.
you lead the pack from the back, not doing it
Yes.
for them, and
Yes.
not, as you call it, not the Moses model, but
Yes.
leading them from the back, equipping them,
Yes.
directing them from the back, which would lead to greater ownership. Awesome.
Yeah.
So I want to shift a little bit and get into the crux of this whole idea of collaboration within the community. So last week we defined community-based collaboration as the process of working with other organizations in the community to achieve a common goal. Community collaborations enrich the church's impact by fostering
Yes.
partnerships and relationships, right? It facilitates this exchange of ideas and best practices. And as a result of the pastor leading the collaboration, the church gains valuable insight into local dynamics and then can tailor its own
Yeah.
initiatives for greater relevance and impact in the community. And while we were there talking, we shared the 5 phases of community collaboration. One of them is provide information and training about the community to the collaborators. A lot of
Yeah.
times, members are a part of a community and know nothing about the
Yeah. Right.
community.
Yeah.
Number two was conduct a community diagnosis to assess the strengths and needs of the community. That's not going to a database always to get information on the community, but really digging into the community, those
Yeah.
members of the various groups in the community to ask questions. And we talked about not being afraid of what the answers are or
Yeah. Right.
response that we get, right? Then number three, analyze the results that we gathered from this information. You know, what are those strengths? What are the weaknesses? Gosh, what can we do as a collaborative to reach a common goal? And then number four, determine what actions are going to be taken. And then number five, and this one stood out to me, was enforce the actions that were taken to ensure that the intended system change takes hold. A lot of times we want to change something, and we plant the seed, but we don't go back and water it.
Yes.
We don't go
That's
back and do anything else. And so with that in mind, with that model in mind, I wonder if you could tell us, Dr. Phil, what are some of the what are some types of collaborations, just off the top of your head, in general? What types of collaborations might pastors readily take the lead on in their community?
I think I'll give you an example. I worked with a church when I was at Community Renewal Society. They wanted to learn community organizing. And it takes about 3 to 5 years to teach a young organizer, myself or anybody else, because you're shifting the brain. You're shifting, like, don't do anything for anybody, lead from the back. So they started to really grow. And one of the issues they took over, it was the first all African American community organization in Chicago in probably a decade, board, staff, neighborhood, and stuff. And so the issue that resonated with them a lot was reentry.
Mhm.
And they built a coalition called the Developing Justice Coalition and spent a lot of time in Springfield, but not only in Springfield, in all the neighborhoods of the city. So talking about, people are, first of all, a lot of it, as you know, was drug offenses. Then people go to jail, and particularly in the African American community. If it was in the white community, you probably went through a program.
Mhm.
And so it was impacting them. And what they did is took over, took a lead on that, went down to the capital, Springfield, and began to change the way. And when they first went down there and started talking to legislators were, let's lock them up. But it was interesting when we would go out to like one of the wealthy suburbs, they would shift and start talking to what we call people's self-interest and saying, do you know it costs $26,000 a year to send somebody to prison? It costs $500 a year to send somebody through a rehab program. So you're talking to, if you're talking in the Black neighborhood, it's clear people know that. If you're talking in a wealthy white neighborhood, you can talk all day, but you're talking to their brain. Once you start talking about taxes, it's just the nature of humans. It's like, okay, now I know I don't like paying taxes.
Mhm.
So, and had a incredible shift. And so people saw this. It helped the church grow. One of the key things, though, is they learned a lot of skills that were applicable to the church.
Mm, mm,
How to grow a church, same thing, agitation, self-interest. And organizing is at its core is about building relationships. And so there's a lot of transferable things. A good example you and I talked about, Father Flager in Chicago has been so successful. Several cardinals have disciplined him for his activities. But he has built one of the few African American Black churches because there's not a lot of Black African Americans, tend to be Baptists or something. But that is a very vibrant church, and people are drawn to it because they see that he and the church are impacting issues that they care about. So, but I would go back and say the same thing. It's not only changing things that they didn't realize they could even change, but it also is taking skills that are really relevant. How do you grow a church? Same thing, you reach out. Um, Bishop Marvin Frank Thomas was very active with in the community he was in Chicago. They ran a homeless shelter in their basement because there was a lot of homeless. But kind of learning some of the skills, he had his senior ministry network. The seniors were running that program as opposed to him.
mhm,
And you could see the growth of the church. You could see the growth of those seniors that they were doing. It wasn't Reverend Thomas doing everything. And
mhm,
he had the courage to step back and let them run it and let them get credit for it.
mhm.
And as a result, as they grew, the church grew.
Absolutely. And that was a remarkable program because of that. Let me you mentioned relationships, and I want to make sure that we don't run out of time. But you mentioned that in this process, the church learned a lot of skills that were
Yeah,
conducive to the
yeah,
church.
yeah,
And one of those you mentioned was relationship building.
yes.
Let me ask you this: what were some of the lessons you learned about building relationships? And I think because pastors really need to understand about this relationship building outside of the pulpit, outside of the church four walls. What were some lessons you learned about that relationship piece?
That you can deliberately and intentionally develop relationships. And as a matter of fact, you should learn how to do that. And organizers learn how to understand what is the community. Self-interest is key. How to understand what the self-interest of the community, what is the self-interest of those seniors who are going to run it. One may like photography, one may like cooking, but how do you begin to plug them into that? And one of the other things is when I first went to CRS, there weren't churches connected to it. So I
Mhm,
had to draw them in.
mhm,
And I thought, I've been going into neighborhoods for 30 years, building an organization from scratch. Could I use those same skills to grow a church?
mhm,
So we took a church in, it was an older white German church in an all black neighborhood, and they were just shutting down. And the pastor wanted to create a multicultural church, which is unusual.
Hmm.
Uh, and so we did it, and they were able to expand. But it's listening to your own people. Why are they there? It's listening to the people outside the doors of your church. What are they looking at? And then it's shifting. Instead of St. Joseph's Day, people aren't going to come in for St. Joseph's. He's probably a nice guy, but Martin Luther King Day. And so our ED, who at CRS, Yvonne Delk, was a world-known leader in the disinvestment movement from South Africa and a fantastic preacher. She came out. And the next ED, Calvin Morris, who worked for Dr. King and ran the King Center, became the co-pastor. So they grew a multiracial church. So relationships, in order to do it, you got to sit down and talk to people. You got to find out, what do they care about?
Sure, sure.
And so if it's your own parishioners, why do you come? If
Hmm.
you're talking to the ones that don't come anymore, how come you don't come? If you're talking to the African American community, you got to listen differently. Is like, what are you interested in? And it ain't St. Joseph,
Right,
So
right.
so
There you go. Oh, awesome, awesome. Well, let me ask you this. So I know that you get asked a lot about this whole idea of being an organizer, leading community collaborations. Well, if you could, what's one question as our time ticks really quickly? What's one question that you ask most about from pastors about this whole idea of collaboration, leading collaborations within a community?
so the first thing that happened when I went to CRS, there was no churches. I interviewed 50 pastors. What do you think the main issue they were dealing with? Because I knew if I could get to their self-interest, I could draw them in.
Uh,
So 75%, what do you think their issue was?
I'm gonna take a stab at it and say finances,
No, church growth,
church growth. That was my next one.
which is tied into finances.
Yes, yes.
So how do I grow a church? How do I bring young people in? When I was studying to be a priest, the biggest issue, the churches were all full. Now they're not. So I think we should be teaching in the seminary. And that's why I did that experiment.
Mm.
Could you teach them organizing skills? And they're very applicable. But I didn't do it because I wanted to grow a church. My self-interest was to attract a lot of pastors, and they did. And Bishop Thomas was one of those. And
Mhm.
he always says that part of that experience, the name of his church was Walls Memorial.
That's right.
He
That's right.
always says part of the experience was getting him to get outside the walls of walls and begin to, talk. So it is something that anybody who's going to be a pastor today has has to learn how to do.
Right,
So
right, right. Wow. Wow. So there is a way to grow the church through collaboration. And,
yes,
and
yes,
and there is a way to meet that need for pastors, to answer that question for pastors. How do
yeah,
I grow a church? And this
yes,
whole idea of collaboration. Listen, so these talks that we have are intended to be a resource for pastors, right? Whether it's through consulting
yeah,
myself, yourself, or
yeah.
someone else, or training or mentoring. What would you tell a pastor when they're going to rev up their administrative skills? And leading community collaborations is an administrative skill that a pastor has to have. What would you
Yes.
say to them about reaching out for help? What would you say to a pastor?
I think that that you're not taught these in school normally. And so you need an expert. One of the things, because while I wasn't going to be a pastor, I did become an executive director. And so, how do you learn about that? I think you learn about that by people like yourself who have those skills.
Mhm.
Um, and then the other thing, where are you going to learn that? I found that like oh, Harvard Business Review and those that are specialized, because not too many people are studying, not too many of these universities are studying nonprofits. They're studying IBM and so they're analyzing that, what makes that, and then having somebody, in the case, what I did is didn't help the pastor, I helped them learn organizing skills. So having somebody like yourself who can kind of guide them through administrative skills, and then where do you learn? You know, in some books. So I started reading Good to Great and a lot of that stuff. So
Awesome. Awesome. Well, so Dr. Field, I want to thank you for sharing your experiences with us in this most critical skill for pastors of leading community-based collaborations. And so thank you so very much for sharing. And I am certain that our listeners and our viewers have gained tons of nuggets. And so in our tradition, as I go to my seat, I want to remind pastors of the idea that a pastor's ability to lead the church requires administrative
yes,
skill.
absolutely.
Preaching is your,
Yes.
that's your one, but
Yeah.
marrying with administrative skills, gosh, imagine what the impact might be. And one
Yeah.
of